Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where ancient whispers settle softly into the quiet corners of the night, and forgotten names are spoken slowly enough to breathe again. Tonight's journey takes us beneath the grand thrones of the sky gods, below the shining courts of the Anunnaki, and into a darker, less discussed layer of Mesopotamian belief. Not the kings, not the storm lords, not the radiant deities who claimed cities and temples, but the beings who moved in their shadow. We are speaking of the Utukku. They were not the rulers of heaven. They were not the architects of creation. They were not praised in hymns or carved in triumphant relief across palace walls. And yet their presence was constant, in sickness, in nightmares, in sudden misfortune, in the quiet dread of an empty room after sunset. If you're listening from somewhere far from the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps from a city lit by electric glow instead of oil lamps, it is worth pausing for a moment and imagining a different world. A world without streetlights, without antibiotics, without the comfort of knowing what caused a fever, a seizure, or a whisper in the dark. In that world, explanations were not optional, they were necessary, and the Utukku became part of that explanation. If you find this kind of slow descent into the ancient world soothing, if the quiet unravelling of forgotten cosmologies brings you a certain calm curiosity, consider giving the video a like, perhaps even subscribing. It helps this quiet corner continue telling stories that might otherwise remain buried beneath sand and broken tablets. Now, settle in. Let the room grow still. Because before we can understand what the Utukku were, we must understand the structure of the world they inhabited. Ancient Mesopotamia did not imagine a simple universe. It was layered, ordered, and supervised. At the highest level stood the great gods, the Anunnaki, figures like Anu, Enlil, and Enki. They governed sky, wind, fresh water, fertility, and law. They were distant and powerful, often portrayed as administrators of cosmic order. Beneath them were other divine beings, lesser gods, local patrons, intermediaries and attendants. The divine realm was not chaotic, it was bureaucratic, and below that ordered divine hierarchy there existed something less stable. The word Utukku appears in Akkadian texts, often translated simply as spirit or demon. But those translations flatten something more complex. In early usage, the term did not automatically mean evil. It referred to a type of supernatural being, one that could be either benevolent or malevolent. There were good Utukku and evil Utukku, protective spirits and harmful ones. Over time, however, the darker aspect became dominant in surviving texts. In incantation tablets and exorcism rituals, the Utukku appear not as helpers, but as threats. They are blamed for illness, for mental disturbance, for unexplained pain, a fever that rose without visible wound, a paralysis that seized the body in the night, a persistent anxiety with no apparent cause. These were not random biological events in the Mesopotamian mind. They were intrusions, and Utukku had entered. This belief did not arise from fantasy in the way modern audiences might imagine. It arose from lived experience. A farmer might wake one morning unable to move his arm. A child might begin speaking incoherently after a high fever. A merchant might lose his appetite and strength for weeks without visible injury. In a world without germ theory, these events demanded explanation. The Utukku provided one. Texts described them as invisible, roaming entities. They could approach silently. They could attach themselves to a person. They could inhabit the body. In some incantations, the exorcist addresses the Utukku directly, commanding it to depart. The tone is formal and legalistic, as though evicting an unwanted tenant. The very existence of these rituals tells us something important. The Utukku were feared, yes, but they were also manageable. They were not cosmic equals to the great gods. They were subordinate forces, disturbances within the system. That distinction matters. They were beneath the Anunnaki, not rivals to them. Some texts refer to Utukku Lemnutu, meaning evil Utukku. The adjective makes clear that not all Utukku were automatically malignant. This dual nature reflects a broader Mesopotamian understanding of spirits. Many beings in their cosmology existed along a spectrum. The same force that protected could also harm. It is tempting to frame the Utukku as simple demons in the later Abrahamic sense, but that would impose a later moral framework onto an earlier worldview. The Mesopotamian cosmos was not organised around absolute good and evil. It was organised around order and disorder, balance and imbalance. The Utukku represented imbalance. In certain texts, they are described as emerging from desolate places. Mountains, ruins, empty fields. Locations outside cultivated city life. Civilization in Mesopotamia was tightly bound to irrigation, agriculture, and temple complexes. Beyond those boundaries lay uncertainty. The Utukku often belonged to that uncertain space. When someone fell ill, the diagnostic texts did not simply note symptoms. They catalogued signs to determine which entity was responsible. Was it a ghost of the dead, known as an Atemu? Was it a specific demon like Lamashtu? Or was it an Utukku? Each possibility required a different ritual response. The exorcist or Ashipu played a central role. He would recite incantations, prepare figurines, burn specific herbs, and call upon higher gods for assistance. In many rituals, the Anunnaki themselves are invoked as authority figures. The logic is clear. If the Utukku are beneath them, then divine command can overrule their intrusion. This hierarchy reinforces the idea that the Utukku were not rogue gods. They were subordinate spirits operating within a structured cosmology. They could cause harm, but they could also be expelled. Interestingly, some descriptions of the Utukku emphasize their formlessness. They are said to have no mouth, yet they cry out. No ears, yet they hear. No limbs, yet they seize. These paradoxical traits suggest that they were conceptualized as forces rather than anthropomorphic beings. They were less like monsters with horns and more like invisible pressures. In a society deeply attuned to omens and signs, this made sense. The Mesopotamians read meaning into eclipses, into the behavior of animals, into the arrangement of stars. An invisible agent causing illness fit comfortably within that interpretive framework. Over time, collections of incantations were compiled specifically targeting the Utukku. One such series is known in modern scholarship as the Utukku Lemnutu texts. These tablets contain long lists of spirits and elaborate ritual instructions. The repetition itself is revealing. Fear demands repetition. Protection demands precision. The very act of writing these incantations on clay suggests institutional seriousness. These were not campfire tales. They were part of temple practice. It is also worth noting that the Utukku do not appear as central villains in epic myth, in the way later demons do in other traditions. They are background threats, environmental hazards of the spiritual world, much like disease itself, and that may be the key to understanding them. In a world where illness could spread through a household with no visible cause, attributing that spread to a roaming spirit gave it narrative shape. It allowed communities to act, to perform rituals, to restore a sense of control. Control matters. Without it, fear becomes paralyzing. With it, even fear can be structured. The Utukku occupied that uneasy middle ground between cosmic order and human vulnerability. They were reminders that beneath the administrative clarity of the Anunnaki's rule, there existed forces that slipped through cracks. For now, it is enough to understand that the Utukku were not a single figure but a category, a type of being woven into Mesopotamian explanations of suffering and misfortune. Beneath the shining names of Anu and Enlil, beneath the formal rituals of the temples, these spirits moved quietly through the margins of daily life. And to see how they came to occupy that space, we need to step back even further, to a time before the word demon existed at all, and look more closely at what the Utukku originally were. Long before the word demon carried the heavy moral weight it does today, before it conjured images of horns, fire, and rebellion against a single omnipotent deity, there existed a far more fluid understanding of unseen beings. In ancient Mesopotamia, the world was not divided cleanly into good and evil in the later theological sense. It was divided into forces that maintained order and forces that disturbed it. The Utukku emerged within that earlier, more practical framework. The term itself appears in Akkadian texts, though its roots stretch back into Sumerian tradition. It did not begin as a label for absolute malevolence. It described a class of spirits. That is the important distinction. A class, not a moral verdict. When scribes wrote of an Utukku, they were identifying a type of presence, not automatically condemning it as wicked. To understand what the Utukku originally were, we must place ourselves in the mental landscape of early Mesopotamia. This was a civilization built between rivers that flooded unpredictably. Crops could flourish one season and fail the next. Illness could appear suddenly and spread without visible cause. Storms rose quickly over flat plains. The environment itself felt animated. It demanded interpretation. The Mesopotamian worldview did not assume emptiness in unexplained spaces. It assumed occupation. If something happened, something caused it. That cause might be visible, like a rival army, or invisible, like a spirit. In early usage, Utukku could refer broadly to a supernatural being. It was not yet restricted to the harmful category that later texts emphasize. Some Utukku were protective, others were neutral. Only over time did the darker connotation begin to dominate. This shift mirrors a broader pattern in ancient religions. Terms that once described ambiguous forces often became narrowed and moralized under later theological developments. But in the beginning, the Utukku were part of a populated cosmos. The Sumerians and Akkadians did not imagine a universe consisting only of gods and humans. There were layers in between. Spirits of the dead, minor divine attendants, local guardians, wandering forces tied to specific places. The boundary between deity and spirit was not sharp. It was porous, and Utukku could inhabit that porous space. Some early texts suggest that Utukku were associated with particular locations: desolate fields, ruins, mountains, steppe regions beyond cultivated land. These were liminal spaces, not fully civilized, not entirely wild, places where the known order thinned. When farmers left irrigated fields and ventured into untamed territory, they crossed into zones where human control diminished. It was natural to imagine that other forces occupied those regions. The Utukku may have begun as spirits tied to such landscapes. This does not mean they were originally monstrous. In fact, the earliest conceptualization seems closer to the idea of a roaming presence, not necessarily malicious, but capable of influence. In some incantation texts, there is a distinction between Utukku Damku, meaning good Utukku, and Utukku Lemnutu, meaning evil Utukku. That distinction would make little sense if the term inherently meant demon in the later sense. It shows that the category was morally flexible. Good Utukku could act as protective spirits. They could guard households. They could repel other harmful entities. This duality reflects the Mesopotamian understanding that the same type of being could operate differently depending on circumstance. The cosmos was not built around fixed moral absolutes. It was built around roles and hierarchies. The Anunnaki stood at the top of the divine hierarchy. Beneath them were other gods and divine officials. Further down were spirits, including Utukku. These spirits were not necessarily rebels or fallen beings. They were components of a structured system. In some interpretations, Utukku may have functioned as enforcers of divine order. If a person violated ritual norms or disrupted balance, a harmful spirit might be allowed to afflict them. In that sense, the spirit was not acting independently but as part of cosmic administration. This perspective reframes the Utukku entirely. They are not chaotic invaders in every context. They are sometimes instruments. Mesopotamian ritual texts reveal a legal tone when addressing spirits. The exorcist does not merely shout them away. He invokes higher authority. He names gods. He cites precedent. The structure resembles a court proceeding. This suggests that spirits like the Utukku were understood to operate within a chain of command. Another important element is how early Mesopotamian language treated the unseen. Words for spirit did not always carry negative implication. The concept of an etemu, the ghost of a deceased person, could be either restless or benign depending on burial rites and offerings. Similarly, Utukku could reflect a presence rather than an enemy. Over time, however, certain patterns hardened. As exorcistic literature expanded, the focus increasingly fell on harmful manifestations. The phrase evil Utukku appears repeatedly in ritual series. These texts catalogue symptoms and assign blame. But even in those later texts, the memory of duality lingers in the language. When we examine the broader religious environment, we also notice that Mesopotamian gods themselves were not purely benevolent by modern standards. Enlil could send floods, Ishtar could unleash plague. The distinction between god and harmful spirit was not absolute. Power determined status. The Utukku were not powerful enough to be worshipped widely, but they were powerful enough to demand ritual response. There are hints in some scholarly discussions that Utukku might originally have been understood as ancestral or chthonic spirits tied to the underworld. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief was not a place of moral punishment. It was a shadow continuation of existence ruled by Ereshkigal. Spirits associated with that realm could cross into the world of the living under certain conditions. Whether Utukku began as such beings remains debated, but the connection to liminal zones, both geographic and existential, is strong. The word demon, as we use it today, carries theological baggage from later monotheistic traditions. It implies rebellion against a singular god, inherent evil, and moral opposition to divine will. That framework did not exist in early Mesopotamia. Instead, there was a layered cosmos filled with agents. Some agents protected, some harmed. Many could do either. The gradual narrowing of Utukku into a primarily harmful category likely reflects social and textual evolution. As exorcism became more systematized, as ritual specialists compiled handbooks, the harmful aspect became more prominent in written sources. Protective roles may have been absorbed into other categories of spirits. It is also possible that over centuries, the lived experience of unpredictable illness and disaster reinforced the negative associations. Language responds to experience. What began as a broad term for spirit gradually became a shorthand for threat, yet traces of the original flexibility remain embedded in the texts. When an Ashipu recited an incantation against the Utukku, he did so with precise formulae. He might fashion small figurines representing the spirit, symbolically transferring illness into clay. He might call upon Shamash, the sun god associated with justice, to expose hidden forces. This ritual complexity implies that the Utukku were taken seriously as part of an integrated cosmology. They were not myths in the modern sense. They were explanations embedded in daily life. It is also worth observing that the Mesopotamian world did not sharply separate religion and medicine. Diagnosis involved both symptom observation and spiritual interpretation. A fever might be described in physical detail and then attributed to a specific spirit. In that context, the Utukku were part of the diagnostic vocabulary. If a child convulsed in sleep, an Utukku might be blamed. If a man experienced sudden paralysis, the explanation might involve spirit intrusion. These were not abstract fears. They were attempts to make sense of bodily vulnerability. And vulnerability was constant. Infant mortality was high. Epidemics were common. Warfare and famine were realities. Invisible causes were easier to imagine than invisible microbes. The Utukku filled that explanatory gap. Yet the key point remains that they did not begin as embodiments of cosmic evil. They began as members of a larger spiritual ecosystem. Over centuries, as texts accumulated and ritual manuals grew, the emphasis shifted. Harmful Utukku became the dominant literary image. Protective aspects faded from view. Later interpreters, encountering mostly exorcistic material, translated the term as demon, translation solidified perception. But if we peel back that later overlay, we see something more nuanced. We see spirits that existed beneath the Anunnaki within a structured universe, capable of influence, sometimes protective, sometimes harmful. Not rebels, not fallen angels, not adversaries in a dualistic war, agents. Understanding this original flexibility prepares us for the next layer of the story. Because once we see the Utukku as part of a hierarchy, rather than as isolated villains, the broader structure of Mesopotamian power begins to matter even more. To understand where the Utukku stood, we must examine the world under the Anunnaki themselves, the hierarchy that defined divine authority, and the space beneath it where these spirits operated. Before the Utukku can be understood fully, the structure above them must be made clear. They did not exist in isolation. They did not roam a chaotic universe without oversight. They moved within a layered system that ancient Mesopotamians believed governed everything from the rising of the sun to the outcome of a court dispute. At the summit of that system stood the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki were not a single god, but a collective designation. In early Sumerian sources, the term referred to a group of high-ranking deities, often described as the offspring of Anu, the sky god. Over time, the word could refer more broadly to the great gods of heaven and earth, particularly those who participated in divine councils. Their authority was administrative as much as cosmic. They determined fates, they oversaw cities, they enforced divine law. In texts such as the Atrahasis epic and portions of the Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki appear as decision-makers. They gather, they deliberate, they assign tasks. The image is not one of emotional spontaneity, but of governance. Divine power in Mesopotamia was structured, not impulsive. Anu represented the highest celestial authority. Enlil governed wind, atmosphere, and command. Enki, also known as Ea in Akkadian tradition, ruled fresh waters and wisdom. Other major gods, such as Inanna, Shamash, Nergal, and Marduk, held specific domains tied to cities, justice, war, or cosmic order. Each had temples, priesthoods, and mythic narratives. Beneath these major deities were lesser gods, attendants, and specialized divine functionaries. The Mesopotamian cosmos resembled a bureaucracy. Roles were distributed. Authority flowed downward. This structure matters because the Utukku did not challenge it. They operated under it. The concept of hierarchy was fundamental to Mesopotamian thought. Just as the king ruled the city and officials reported to him, so too did the gods operate in chains of command. Even the underworld had its ruler, Ereshkigal, who presided over the land of the dead. Her authority did not negate that of the Anunnaki. It functioned within the broader cosmic system. The idea that every domain had supervision reinforced a worldview of order. Floods, eclipses, famines, victories in war, and even personal misfortune could be interpreted as part of divine administration. The world was not random, it was governed. Where then did the Utukku fit into this arrangement? They did not sit in council, they did not receive worship in grand temples, they did not issue decrees that shaped civilizations. Instead, they occupied a lower tier, one that was active but subordinate. Some texts imply that spirits like the Utukku could act as instruments. If a god was displeased with a person, a city, or a king, affliction might follow. That affliction could be conceptualized as the work of a spirit. The Utukku in that sense were executors, not policymakers. This is an important distinction. Later traditions often imagine demons as rebels who oppose divine will. In Mesopotamian thought, harmful spirits were more often seen as enforcers or side effects within the divine order. Consider how illness was described. A tablet might state that a particular ailment was sent by a god or inflicted by a spirit. The two explanations were not mutually exclusive. A god might permit or dispatch a spirit to carry out punishment. In that model, the Utukku were beneath the Anunnakian authority but still within their jurisdiction. The structure extended further. Beneath the level of spirits like the Utukku were ghosts of the dead, known as etemu. These were human souls residing in the underworld who could sometimes trouble the living if proper rites were neglected. Even they operated within the rules of the cosmic hierarchy. Every entity had a place. The Mesopotamian emphasis on hierarchy also influenced ritual practice. When confronting an Utukku, the exorcist did not rely on personal strength. He invoked higher names. Shamash might be called upon for justice. Ea might be invoked for wisdom and cleansing. The ritual acknowledged that authority flowed from above. Without that structure, the ritual would lack foundation. Temple architecture reflected this layered worldview. Ziggurats rose in tiered forms, symbolically bridging earth and heaven. Priests operated in ranks. Offerings followed schedules. Nothing in sacred space was casual. The same order applied to unseen forces. It is tempting in modern retellings to blur distinctions and imagine a chaotic swarm of demons beneath the gods. The tablets do not support that image. Instead, they reveal categorization. There were named spirits with specific attributes. There were lists and series identifying different types of harmful beings. The Utukku were one category among several. Others included Lamashtu, often associated with harming infants. Pazuzu paradoxically invoked for protection against Lamashtu. The Sebetu, a group of 7 destructive spirits. Each had characteristics. Each had ritual responses. This classification mirrors administrative thinking. Even chaos was catalogued. The Anunnaki, as divine overseers, maintained cosmic balance. When disorder intruded, it did so within parameters. A storm might devastate a field, but it was still part of atmospheric reality. Similarly, a spirit might afflict a person, but it did so within a framework of divine causation. This perspective reduced existential uncertainty. The world was dangerous, but not meaningless. The underworld provides further insight into hierarchy. Ruled by Ereshkigal and her consort Nergal in some traditions, it was not depicted as a moral sorting ground, but as a domain with its own officials and judges. The Anunnaki themselves are sometimes described as judges in the underworld. Spirits associated with that realm, possibly including some Utukku, operated within its jurisdiction. That does not mean all Utukku were underworld entities. Their origins may be varied, but the cosmological map placed them below the great gods. The distinction between heaven, earth, and underworld formed a vertical axis of power. Heaven housed the highest deities. Earth was the domain of humans and active divine intervention. The underworld held the dead and certain chthonic forces. The Utukku moved along this axis but did not transcend it. When Mesopotamian kings described their legitimacy, they often referenced approval from high gods. Victory in battle signified divine favour. Conversely, defeat could signal divine displeasure. If a plague swept through a city, it might be interpreted as a sign of divine judgment. The specific mechanism of that plague, however, could be described in terms of spirits. The Utukku thus functioned at the level where divine decision intersected human experience. This layered causality is essential. At the top, gods decide. Beneath them, forces execute. At the bottom, humans suffer or prosper. Within this framework, the Utukku were neither supreme nor independent. They were beneath the Anunnaki in rank, in authority, and in narrative importance. And yet, for ordinary people, they were immediate. A high god might feel distant. A temple statue might represent divine presence in a formal way. But the sudden onset of illness or dread felt intimate. That intimacy gave spirits like the Utukku a different kind of relevance. Their power was localized. A king might worry about the favour of Marduk. A mother might worry about the presence of an Utukku near her child's bed. The hierarchy did not diminish fear, it contextualized it. In legal documents and royal inscriptions, the Anunnaki appear as guarantors of oaths. They punish falsehood. They establish order. In exorcistic texts, they are invoked to banish harmful spirits. Their authority is the ultimate appeal. The Utukku do not defy this appeal in the texts. They are commanded to depart in the name of higher gods. That compliance reinforces subordination. Some scholars suggest that the very multiplicity of spirits in Mesopotamian belief reflects an attempt to systematize unpredictability. By assigning names and categories, by placing beings within a hierarchy, the unknown became administrable. The Anunnaki provided the top tier of that system. Below them, every other force found its place. Understanding this hierarchy clarifies that the Utukku were not cosmic rivals or ancient adversaries plotting rebellion. They were lower-tier spirits within a structured universe, sometimes harmful, sometimes perhaps neutral, always beneath the greater powers. And within that layered structure, their nature remained dual for a time, capable of both protection and affliction, a complexity that becomes clearer when we look directly at the distinction between good Utukku and evil Utukku, spirits whose difference lay not in species but in function. The world the Mesopotamians described was not divided into bright and dark with a clean line between them. It was layered, graded, and full of forces that shifted depending on context. The Utukku existed inside that flexibility. They were not originally stamped with a single moral identity. Some were harmful, some were protective. The distinction was not cosmetic. It was written directly into the language. Texts refer to Utukku Damk, the good Utukku, and Utukku Lemnutu, the evil Utukku. That pairing alone tells us something essential. The category itself was neutral. It could be modified. The spirit was defined by behaviour, not by species. This duality is not unusual in Mesopotamian religion. Gods themselves were capable of both blessing and destruction. Enlil could grant prosperity and send storms. Ishtar could inspire love and unleash war. The same divine force could nurture or devastate depending on circumstances. There was no expectation that power must align permanently with benevolence. The Utukku reflected that same logic at a lower tier. A good Utukku might serve as a protective presence attached to a household or individual. Protective spirits were common in Mesopotamian life. Amulets, incantations, and figurines were used to invite or reinforce helpful forces. These spirits guarded thresholds, watched over infants, and deflected illness, while the term Utukku eventually became heavily associated with harm in later exorcistic literature. Early distinctions suggest that not all Utukku were feared. Some were aligned with order. Protection in Mesopotamian thought was not abstract. It was practical. Doorways were vulnerable points. Beds were vulnerable points. The body itself was vulnerable. Protective spirits were stationed where weakness existed. A good Utukku may have functioned as one of these stationed forces. By contrast, the evil Utukku was associated with intrusion. It entered without invitation. It disturbed bodily equilibrium. It brought symptoms. Fever, trembling, confusion and wasting were attributed to hostile spirits in diagnostic texts. The difference between the two types lay in orientation toward the individual and toward divine order. If a spirit reinforced order, guarded the boundary, and aligned with divine authority, it was good. If it violated boundaries, introduced suffering, and disrupted balance, it was evil. The moral framing is tied to outcome. This dual potential reveals something about Mesopotamian psychology. The unseen was not inherently malicious. It was potent. Potency could be directed. When illness struck, it did not mean that all spirits were malevolent. It meant that a specific harmful force was at work. Ritual specialists did not reject the entire category of spirits. They isolated the hostile one. This isolation process appears in incantation texts. The Ashipu identifies the affliction and names it. Naming is power. Once the evil Utukku is identified, it can be addressed, commanded, expelled. The ritual sometimes involves symbolic transfer. A clay figurine might represent the spirit. The illness is verbally transferred into the figurine, which is then destroyed or buried. The ritual does not destroy all Utukku. It targets one manifestation. This precision reflects a worldview comfortable with complexity. There is also a broader theological implication. If both good and evil Utukku existed, then the spiritual ecosystem mirrored the physical one. Just as rivers could nourish or flood, spirits could guard or harm. Mesopotamian religion was less concerned with permanent moral categories and more concerned with maintaining balance. Balance was not guaranteed. It required ritual reinforcement. Protective spirits, including benevolent Utukku, were part of that reinforcement. Some texts blur distinctions between Utukku and other spirit types, which suggests overlapping functions. The boundaries between categories were not always rigid. A spirit could be described differently depending on context. This fluidity complicates modern interpretation. Translators often prefer fixed definitions. Ancient belief tolerated ambiguity. When later scribes compiled series like the Utukku Lemnutu Incantations, the harmful aspect became dominant in writing. Protective roles may have been absorbed into other spirit categories, or perhaps they were so integrated into daily practice that they required less textual emphasis. Fear demands documentation. Protection can remain assumed. Even within harmful descriptions, the evil Utukku are not portrayed as independent sovereigns. They are subordinate entities. Their capacity to harm is real, but it is limited by higher authority. The ritual language often commands them in the name of major gods. The fact that a spirit can be commanded reinforces its position beneath divine law. The good Utukku, on the other hand, are aligned with that law. They act as guardians rather than invaders. There is also an interpretive layer tied to illness. Mesopotamian medical texts sometimes distinguish between ailments caused by gods and those caused by spirits. This suggests that not every sickness was automatically the work of an Utukku. If a harmful spirit was identified, it was a specific diagnosis. This diagnostic nuance implies that the concept of Utukku evolved alongside medical and ritual practice. As knowledge expanded and symptoms were catalogued, spirits were classified with increasing specificity. In that process, duality became more defined. It is possible that in very early stages, Utukku simply meant spirit. Over time, as certain spirits became associated more frequently with harm, the adjective evil became more common in written sources. Language narrowed perception. Still, the preserved references to good Utukku resist the later simplification of the term as demon. The idea of dual nature also aligns with Mesopotamian cosmology at large. The universe was not a battlefield between two absolute forces of good and evil. It was a managed system where disruption occurred within structure. The Utukku were part of that system. A protective Utukku could be imagined as stationed near a doorway, repelling intrusion. A harmful Utukku could be imagined as slipping past that station when ritual vigilance failed. Responsibility often fell on humans to maintain correct practice. Neglected offerings, broken taboos, or ritual impurity might weaken spiritual defences. In that sense, duality also reinforced social order. Proper behaviour invited protection. Improper behaviour invited vulnerability. This does not mean that every affliction was seen as deserved. Random suffering existed in Mesopotamian thought. But the framework allowed for explanation. The presence of both good and evil Utukku within the same category demonstrates that Mesopotamian spirituality was not driven by stark binaries. It allowed for gradation and change. A spirit's status could depend on context. That flexibility fades in later religious developments, where demons become fixed enemies of divine will. In the Mesopotamian context, even harmful spirits operated within limits. Understanding this duality sets the stage for examining how the evil aspect became so prominent, because while good Utukku existed in language and belief, the texts that survive focus heavily on illness, invasion, and exorcism. To see why the harmful Utukku gained such literary weight, we must look at how they were connected to physical suffering itself, how the body became the battlefield where unseen forces expressed their presence. In ancient Mesopotamia, the body was not a sealed biological system. It was porous. It could be influenced from above by gods, from below by the underworld, and from all sides by roaming spirits. When illness appeared, it was not merely a malfunction of flesh, it was an event, an intrusion, a message. Within this framework, the Utukku came to be understood less as distant presences and more as agents of affliction. They did not simply exist in ruins or wander the steppe. They entered people. Cuneiform medical and diagnostic texts provide a window into how seriously this was taken. These tablets list symptoms with careful detail: fever patterns, muscle weakness, skin discoloration, seizures, mental disturbance. The observation is often clinical in tone. The interpretation, however, includes spiritual causation. A line might read that if a patient trembles and cannot stand, an evil Utukku has seized him. If a child cries through the night and refuses food, a spirit may be present. If a man experiences confusion or speaks incoherently, an invisible force may have taken hold. This is not metaphor, it is explanation. To modern readers, it may be tempting to reduce this to superstition. But in a world without microbial theory, the sudden onset of symptoms demanded narrative structure. Illness that came without visible wound had to come from somewhere. The Utukku provided a source. The concept of seizure by a spirit appears frequently. The body is described as being gripped, held, or bound. These descriptions mirror the physical sensations of certain conditions. Paralysis, muscle spasms, and fainting could easily be interpreted as external force. Even psychological conditions were folded into this system. Anxiety, melancholy, and erratic behavior appear in diagnostic series. Some cases attribute such states to divine displeasure. Others point to spirits like the Utukku. The body became the location where unseen hierarchies expressed themselves. This is where the shift from neutral spirit to feared invader became stronger. While good Utukku may have existed conceptually, the texts that survive emphasize harm. The surviving corpus is heavily weighted toward exorcistic literature. Ritual specialists recorded what needed intervention. Protection leaves fewer records than crisis. The Ashipu, the exorcist priest, functioned at the intersection of medicine and ritual. He did not ignore physical symptoms. He documented them. But he interpreted them through a cosmological lens. If a fever rose at dusk and intensified at night, that timing might matter. If dreams were disturbed, that too was evidence. The pattern of symptoms could suggest which spirit was responsible. Utukku often appear in such contexts as afflictors. The rituals designed to remove them were complex. Incantations were recited in Akkadian or Sumerian. Water was poured. Oils were applied. Figurines representing the spirit were fashioned and symbolically burdened with the illness. The logic was precise. If the spirit had attached itself to the body, it had to be detached. The ritual created a pathway for departure. In some texts, the exorcist addresses the Utukku directly, commanding it to leave the flesh and return to the steppe or the underworld. The language is forceful but structured. Authority is invoked. Shamash is called as witness. Ea is invoked for cleansing. The body in this framework is contested territory. It is important to note that not every illness was attributed to an Utukku. The Mesopotamian medical corpus distinguishes between conditions. Some ailments were treated primarily with herbs and poultices. Others required incantations. Many cases involved both. This blending of approaches shows that the belief in spirits did not exclude practical remedies. The system was integrative. Still, when symptoms seemed inexplicable or severe, spiritual causation became more likely. Nighttime illnesses were particularly associated with spirits. Darkness reduced visibility. Dreams blurred boundaries. Sleep paralysis, for instance, could be interpreted as the pressure of a spirit sitting on the chest. Descriptions of inability to move while conscious align closely with modern accounts of such episodes. Without neurological explanation, the presence of an Utukku offered coherence. The idea of the spirit as messenger also appears in broader theology. Gods might send illness as punishment. The Utukku could function as carriers of that punishment. In that sense, they were not random attackers, they were emissaries. The body thus became the point where divine displeasure, spiritual intrusion, and human vulnerability intersected. Fear was not abstract, it was personal. A farmer could survive a storm, he could rebuild after a flood. But an invisible illness attacking his child was harder to fight. The Utukku embodied that helplessness. The emphasis on expulsion rituals reveals another psychological dimension. By externalizing illness as a spirit, the community could act against it. The sufferer was not morally corrupted flesh. The sufferer was invaded. Invasion can be reversed. This narrative preserves dignity. Even when illness was interpreted as punishment for sin or ritual impurity, the mechanism involved a spirit. Removal of the spirit through ritual restored balance. There are tablets in which the exorcist recites long lists of possible spirits responsible for the affliction, including the Utukku. The repetition is almost exhaustive. Every potential invader is named and commanded. This litany reflects both fear and control. Naming is containment. The harmful Utukku in these contexts are described as unseen, roaming, and opportunistic. They approach from the steppe. They emerge from ruins. They attach themselves in moments of weakness. Such imagery reinforces their association with liminal spaces. Illness, too, is a liminal state. The sick person exists between health and death. In that threshold, spirits operate. The body as battlefield does not imply chaos. It implies contest within order. The spirit enters. The ritual confronts. The higher gods arbitrate. Victory is possible. The structure mirrors military logic. The body is a city. The spirit is an intruder. The exorcist is the defender invoking higher authority. This metaphor would resonate in a civilization frequently engaged in warfare. The more the Mesopotamian world systematized illness, the more the harmful aspect of the Utukku was reinforced. Over centuries, the literary emphasis on their role as afflictors solidified their reputation. Yet even in this role, they remained beneath the Anunnaki. They did not act without possibility of command. Understanding this relationship between spirit and body clarifies why the Utukku became so closely associated with physical suffering. It also prepares us to examine another dimension of their presence, not just as invaders of flesh, but as forces linked to the untamed spaces beyond cultivated life, descending from mountains and storms, embodying the unpredictable violence of nature itself. Beyond the irrigated fields and mud-brick walls of Mesopotamian cities lay a different world. The land flattened into steppe, then rose in the distance toward mountains that marked the edges of the known horizon. Those mountains were not merely geographical features, they represented distance, unpredictability, and foreignness. For a civilization whose stability depended on controlled waterways and measured agriculture, the highlands were reminders that control had limits. It is not surprising, then, that many harmful forces in Mesopotamian thought were imagined as coming from beyond the settled plain. The Utukku, especially in their darker form, were often described as descending from mountains, emerging from desolate terrain, or riding in on wind and storm. The language is consistent. They approach from outside. The cultivated city stood for order. The mountain stood for uncertainty. Storm imagery reinforces this association. Enlil, lord of wind and atmosphere, governed storms at a divine level. But lesser forces could accompany those atmospheric disturbances. When winds howled across the plain and dust darkened the sky, it was easy to imagine unseen presences moving within the gusts. Wind is invisible but forceful. It presses against the body. It enters the lungs. It carries dust and disease. In a pre-scientific context, wind was a perfect vehicle for spirit activity. Some incantation texts refer to the evil Utukku as coming with the wind or riding on storm clouds. The connection is practical as well as symbolic. Seasonal winds could precede outbreaks of illness. Dust storms might aggravate breathing conditions. To ancient observers, correlation suggested causation. If sickness followed storm, then the storm carried something. Mountains, too, had a layered significance. They were associated with foreign lands, with enemies, and with gods whose domains were distant from the Mesopotamian core. In myth, mountains often functioned as thresholds between worlds. To say that the Utukku descended from mountains was to locate them in liminal geography. These were not urban spirits. They did not dwell comfortably among temple courtyards. They approached from margins. The Mesopotamian imagination linked danger with boundary zones. The steppe beyond irrigation ditches was home to wild animals and nomadic tribes. Ruins of abandoned settlements were places where normal social life had collapsed. Mountains were distant, difficult to traverse, and inhabited by peoples perceived as different. The Utukku reflect that pattern of thought. Invisible attack from beyond the horizon mirrors the lived reality of invasion. Armies could descend from highlands. Raiding parties could emerge without warning. The same anxiety could be mapped onto the spiritual world. If a city feared sudden assault, it was logical to imagine spirits approaching in similar fashion. There is also the acoustic dimension. Wind produces sound without visible source. It whistles through cracks, rattles doors, shakes shutters. In the quiet of night, these sounds can feel animate. Without artificial lighting and insulated walls, ancient households were intimately aware of the night's noises. A sudden gust could extinguish a lamp. A door might creak. A child might wake crying. The idea that an Utukku travelled in wind offered narrative explanation for these disruptions. Storms themselves were not inherently evil. They were part of Enlil's domain. But minor forces within them could be disruptive. This layered causality preserved divine order while allowing for harmful intrusion. The Utukku in this imagery are not solitary monsters. They are part of atmospheric disturbance. In some texts they are described as lacking clear form. They are not depicted consistently with horns or claws. Instead, they are described through effects. They seize, they strike, they cause trembling. Their invisibility parallels wind itself. This lack of fixed physical description reinforces their association with natural forces. It is worth considering that respiratory illnesses would have been common in dusty, windswept environments. If wind preceded coughing, fever or weakness, then the narrative of invisible attack carried by air would feel convincing. The boundary between environmental hazard and spiritual threat was thin. Even the word for spirit in various ancient languages often overlaps with breath or wind. The movement of air was tied conceptually to life force. When breath faltered, something unseen had intervened. The Utukku fit into that conceptual space. Mountains also held mythological significance as homes of certain gods or as barriers between realms. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, mountains guard the path to the cedar forest. They are guarded by monstrous beings. They mark the edges of civilization. When harmful spirits are described as descending from mountains, the narrative suggests that danger originates from outside the protected sphere. The descent imagery is spatially clear, from high to low, from outside to inside, from wilderness to city. This directional movement parallels illness progression. A healthy body becomes invaded. An ordered space becomes disrupted. Storm and wind provide the mechanism. There is also the seasonal dimension. Mesopotamian agriculture depended on predictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, but unpredictable storms could damage crops or infrastructure. Natural volatility reinforced the sense that unseen forces were active beyond human control. To attribute that volatility to spirits like the Utukku was not to deny divine governance. It was to fill explanatory gaps within that governance. Ritual responses often included appeals to Shamash or Ea to drive back the harmful wind and expel the spirit riding within it. The imagery is consistent. The spirit is not rooted. It is mobile. Mobility increases threat. A fixed danger can be avoided. A roaming one cannot. This roaming quality also explains why the Utukku were not confined to specific shrines. They were not worshipped. They were warded against. Amulets and protective incantations were placed at thresholds, near windows, and at bedsides. The wind entered through openings. Protection had to guard those openings. Architecture and belief intersect here. Thick mud brick walls offered insulation but were not airtight. Open courtyards allowed air circulation. Night breezes cooled interiors but also carried fear. The Utukku moved through that breeze in imagination. There is no need to imagine theatrical storms every time. Even a gentle wind could be suspect if illness followed. The invisibility of air made it an ideal carrier for unseen presence. This association between wind and spirit also aligns with broader Near Eastern traditions. Later cultures continue to link spirits with air and desolate places. The idea that something unseen travels on wind persists across centuries. In Mesopotamia, that idea was structured into ritual practice. The descent from mountains is not just geographical. It is symbolic of forces entering from outside the managed world. The Anunnaki presided over cosmic order, but they did not eliminate unpredictability. They structured it. Harmful spirits descending from wild terrain reflected the reality that even within divine governance, instability existed. The Utukku, carried by storm and wind, embodied that instability. Yet even here their subordination remains visible. They are not storm gods. They are riders within storms. They do not command the mountain. They descend from it. Understanding this imagery clarifies why the Utukku felt both environmental and personal. A gust of wind across the plain could become an invisible hand on the body. And if wind connected heaven and earth, if mountains marked thresholds between realms, then it is not surprising that the Utukku were also associated with another boundary altogether, the boundary beneath the earth itself, where the underworld awaited and where certain spirits found another kind of residence. Beneath the flatlands of Sumer and Akkad, beneath irrigation channels and temple foundations, beneath the graves carefully lined with offerings, lay another realm entirely. It was not a place of fire or moral torment, it was a place of shadow. The Mesopotamians called it Kur, or Akala. It was the land of no return, and presiding over it was a queen, not a tyrant, but a ruler of inevitability. Her name was Ereshkigal. In the layered cosmology of Mesopotamia, the underworld was not an afterthought. It was a structured domain with gates, judges, officials, and laws. The dead did not vanish into abstraction. They travelled downward. They passed through 7 gates. They were received and processed. Order extended even there. Within that shadowed structure, spirits operated. The Utukku, already associated with liminal spaces and invisible intrusion, found a natural connection to the underworld. Some texts imply that certain harmful spirits originated from below, rising upward from the domain of the dead to afflict the living. This does not mean every Utukku was an underworld being, but it does mean that the boundary between earth and underworld was porous in Mesopotamian thought. The underworld was ruled, not chaotic. Ereshkigal governed it with authority parallel to that of the great gods above. In some myths, the Anunnaki themselves are described as judges in her realm. The cosmic hierarchy did not end at the soil line. If harmful spirits emerged from below, they did so within that jurisdiction. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief was not divided by moral merit. Kings and commoners alike entered. What mattered most was proper burial and offerings. A neglected dead person might become restless. A properly honoured one remained settled. This context is important because spirits like the Utukku were sometimes conceptually adjacent to ghosts, the Atemu. Ghosts were specifically human souls. Utukku were not necessarily human, yet both could trouble the living. The distinction lay in origin. Ghosts were former people. Utukku were autonomous spirits. Still, the underworld provided a plausible origin point for roaming harmful entities. It was beneath. It was dark. It was associated with decay and silence. When an illness was particularly severe or accompanied by dreams of the dead, the diagnostic logic might incline toward underworld involvement. There are incantations that command harmful spirits to return to the underworld, to the house of Ereshkigal. The language implies that the spirit does not belong among the living. It has crossed a boundary. Crossing boundaries is the consistent pattern. The Mesopotamian imagination was deeply attentive to thresholds. Doors required protection. City walls marked safety. Even the transition between waking and sleeping was a vulnerable state. The boundary between life and death was the ultimate threshold. Spirits that moved between these domains carried heightened fear. Some mythological texts describe the underworld as guarded by gatekeepers and enforced by officials. If a spirit rose from there without authorization, it would represent disorder. Yet there is little indication that the Utukku were rebels staging escape. More often, they appear as permitted disturbances. Illness was not random chaos. It was integrated into divine structure. The underworld also housed judges, sometimes described as Anunnaki in that realm. They decided fates of the dead. That administrative tone mirrors the governance above. If Utukku were servants or instruments operating at lower levels of that realm, they would still be part of structured authority. It is important not to impose later dualistic narratives onto this system. There is no cosmic war between heaven and hell in Mesopotamian theology. There is division of domain. Ereshkigal does not oppose the sky gods in rebellion. She governs what lies beneath. The Utukku and their association with underworld imagery reflect that governance. In some incantation series, the harmful spirit is described as coming from the grave or the land of the dead. The ritual then calls upon higher authority to drive it back to its proper place. The concept of proper place is key. Everything in the Mesopotamian cosmos had a place. Gods had temples, kings had thrones, the dead had the underworld. When something left its place and entered another domain improperly, imbalance occurred. An Utukku afflicting a living person was out of place. The exorcist's task was not annihilation, it was relocation. Return to where you belong. This emphasis reinforces the idea that the Utukku were not metaphysical evil incarnate. They were misplaced forces. The underworld was also associated with dryness and dust. In myth, the dead consume dust and drink muddy water. Such imagery reinforces sterility and depletion. If illness wasted the body, drained strength, and reduced vitality, it mirrored underworld conditions. Thus, attributing severe illness to a spirit from below aligned physical symptoms with cosmological symbolism. Dreams further deepen this connection. Dreams were seen as spaces where boundaries thinned. Messages from gods, omens of the future, and disturbances from spirits could occur there. If a person dreamed repeatedly of graves, darkness, or dead relatives, it could indicate underworld influence. An Utukku connected to that realm might be suspected. There are mythic parallels that strengthen this association. In the tale of Inanna's descent, she passes through 7 gates to reach the underworld ruled by Ereshkigal. The imagery of layered descent and stripping away reinforces the structure of that realm. The underworld was not abstract. It was architectural. Spirits moving between its gates and the world of the living would be imagined as traversing real thresholds. Some scholars have suggested that certain harmful spirits, possibly including classes of Utukku, were conceptualized as underworld officials enforcing decrees. If a god determined that a person's time had ended, the mechanism might involve an underworld spirit. In that interpretation, the Utukku are not random attackers but part of mortality's machinery. Mortality itself was not seen as injustice. It was structure. Yet premature illness, unexplained suffering or prolonged affliction could still be contested through ritual. This tension between inevitability and intervention runs throughout Mesopotamian spirituality. The underworld connection gives the Utukku depth beyond mere atmospheric menace. They are not only wind riders descending from mountains, they are also possible emissaries rising from below. Above, the Anunnaki deliberate. Below, Ereshkigal reigns. Between these domains lies the human world, exposed on both sides. The Utukku move along that vertical axis. Understanding this verticality clarifies their position. They are beneath the great gods, possibly aligned with underworld administration, but still subordinate. Their power is real but constrained. This connection to the underworld also intensifies the psychological dimension. Illness felt like a brush with death. Death belonged below. If a spirit from below had touched the body, the proximity to mortality was immediate. Ritual expulsion was not just about health. It was about pulling someone back from the edge. As these associations deepened over centuries, the textual emphasis on harmful Utukku expanded. Exorcistic literature grew more detailed. Lists of spirits multiplied, incantations lengthened. The next development in this story lies in how those rituals were performed, how clay, water, and spoken formulae were used to confront invisible presences, and how exorcists built an entire professional practice around battling beings that could not be seen. In the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, illness did not unfold in silence. It triggered response. When a person began to tremble without cause, when fever lingered beyond the expected course, when nightmares returned night after night, a specialist was summoned. Not merely a healer in the physical sense, but a ritual authority trained in words, gestures, and sacred procedure. He was known as the Ashipu, often translated as exorcist. The Ashipu did not improvise. He worked from tradition. Cuneiform tablets recovered from sites such as Nineveh and Ashur preserve long ritual series detailing exactly how to confront harmful spirits. Among the most prominent collections are the texts modern scholars refer to as the Utukku Lemnutu series, a body of incantations specifically targeting evil Utukku. These were not casual charms, they were structured liturgies. When a patient was diagnosed as afflicted by an Utukku, the Ashipu began by observing symptoms. He noted patterns. He determined timing. He consulted omen literature. Diagnosis was a process. Only then did the ritual confrontation begin. The language of incantation was formal and repetitive. Repetition was not redundancy. It was reinforcement. The spirit was named again and again, identified as evil, commanded to depart. The exorcist invoked higher authority, often calling upon Shamash for justice and Ea for purification. Authority flowed downward. The Ashipu positioned himself not as an independent combatant, but as a representative of divine order. He stood between the afflicted body and the invisible force, armed not with weapons but with sanctioned speech. Speech itself carried power. In Mesopotamian thought, words were not empty symbols, they enacted reality. A curse spoken correctly could bind. A blessing spoken precisely could protect. An incantation, when recited with proper formula, altered the spiritual landscape. This belief in performative speech gave exorcism structure. The ritual often involved water, a substance deeply associated with Ea, god of fresh waters and wisdom. Water purified. It cleansed ritual impurity. It symbolized restoration of order. The Ashipu might sprinkle water over the patient while reciting commands. The water was not magical by itself. It was activated through invocation. Clay figurines played a significant role as well. Small representations of the offending spirit were crafted from clay, sometimes inscribed or symbolically marked. These figurines functioned as stand-ins. The illness was verbally transferred into them. The spirit was invited, commanded, or compelled to enter the clay form. Once the transfer was ritually completed, the figurine was destroyed, buried, or cast into water. The symbolism is direct. The spirit is displaced from flesh to clay. Clay was an appropriate medium. Humanity itself was described in myth as formed from clay mixed with divine substance. To use clay as a vessel for spirit expulsion mirrored cosmological creation in reverse. Creation and removal followed parallel logic. Some rituals required the figurines to be placed at thresholds or buried beneath doorways. These placements created spiritual barriers. If an Utukku attempted re-entry, it would encounter its own bound representation. Protection was layered. Amulets were also common. Protective symbols were worn around the neck or hung near beds. The goal was deterrence. If an evil Utukku approached, it would be repelled by divine names inscribed on objects. The Ashipu's role extended beyond emergency response. He educated households in preventative measures, proper offerings, correct ritual purity, and adherence to temple calendar reinforced spiritual defences. This preventative dimension reveals that fighting the invisible was ongoing, not episodic. Incantations often included vivid imagery. The spirit is described as roaming the desert, entering the house like smoke, seizing limbs, clouding the mind. These descriptions made the unseen tangible. To confront something, it must be imagined. The Ashipu did not deny the fear of the afflicted. He validated it within structured cosmology. The Utukku was named, it was categorized, it was addressed. In some rituals, multiple spirits are listed in sequence. The Ashipu recites long enumerations of possible afflictors, commanding each to depart. This exhaustive listing prevented oversight. If one spirit was misidentified, another might still be responsible. Better to command them all. The ritual environment itself reinforced authority. The Ashipu wore specific garments. He may have held ritual tools. Sacred space was demarcated. The performance mattered as much as the words. There is also evidence that medical practitioners known as ASU worked alongside exorcists. The ASU applied herbal treatments, poultices, and practical remedies. The Ashipu addressed spiritual cause. In many cases, the same individual may have held overlapping knowledge. The dichotomy between medicine and religion is modern. In Mesopotamia, they were intertwined. The patient experienced relief not only from physical treatment, but from restored narrative coherence. The invisible attacker had been identified and driven out. This restoration of order was psychological as well as spiritual. It is important to note that exorcism was not always successful. Tablets sometimes describe persistent illness. Repeated rituals might be necessary. The Ashipu could not guarantee outcomes. Divine will remained ultimate. Yet the existence of standardized ritual literature shows confidence in the system. The invisible was not beyond engagement. The Utukku in this framework were formidable, but not untouchable. They could be confronted through authorized channels. In some incantations, the spirit is addressed directly with legal language. The Ashipu might declare that the afflicted person belongs to a specific god, and therefore cannot be claimed by the spirit. Ownership is invoked. The spirit is trespassing. This legal metaphor aligns with the broader hierarchical worldview. Every person was under the patronage of a deity. To afflict that person without divine sanction was overreach. The ritual reasserts boundaries. There are even texts that depict dialogue between the exorcist and the spirit, though these are formulaic rather than narrative. The spirit is told that its time in the body is over. It is ordered to return to desert, mountain, or underworld. Return to proper domain. Fighting the invisible did not require physical violence. It required alignment with higher order. The clay figurine, once buried, symbolized containment. The incantation once spoken symbolized enforcement. This ritual technology reveals that the Mesopotamian fear of spirits like the Utukku was paired with structured response. They did not resign themselves to affliction. Understanding this ritual system clarifies how deeply embedded the Utukku were in daily life. They were not distant mythic figures. They were potential explanations for suffering that required active management, and as ritual literature developed, certain patterns began to emerge more strongly, including the repeated appearance of groups of 7 spirits, a number that carried symbolic weight and would become central in descriptions of destructive forces often linked with the Utukku. There is a number that echoes through Mesopotamian text with steady insistence. It appears in omen literature, it appears in myth, it appears in ritual instruction. The number is 7. 7 gates to the underworld. 7 judges, 7 days marking sacred cycles, 7 winds. seven sages. And among the most feared spiritual forces in incantation literature, seven destructive spirits known collectively as the Sebetu. The Sebetu were not identical to the Utukku, but their imagery overlaps in ways that matter. In many exorcistic texts, the Sebetu are invoked alongside the evil Utukku, or listed in the same breath as roaming harmful spirits. The repetition of seven suggests pattern, not coincidence. To understand why seven recurs so persistently, we must step into Mesopotamian symbolic thinking. Seven represented completeness within a cycle. It was not arbitrary, it was structural. Lunar phases divide into roughly 7-day segments. Agricultural observation of moon and tide reinforced this rhythm. The Mesopotamians organised time around such patterns. Sacred days often followed 7-day intervals. Thus, seven spirits could symbolise totality of destructive force. The Sebetu, whose name simply means the seven, appear in various texts as a collective of fierce beings. They are described as storm-like, weapon-bearing, and relentless. In some accounts, they are connected to Nergal, a god associated with plague in the underworld. Their depiction emphasises ferocity rather than subtle intrusion. Where the Utukku often appear as invisible afflictors entering the body, the Sebetu are sometimes described as marching, attacking, or sweeping across land like a military unit. Yet the conceptual overlap is significant. Both represent harm that descends upon humanity from beyond immediate control. In some incantations, the exorcist lists both the evil Utukku and the Sebetu among the forces to be expelled. The grouping suggests that the Sebetu may be understood as a specialised subset of destructive spirits, possibly overlapping categories within broader spiritual taxonomy. The insistence on seven amplifies their presence. Seven spirits can feel more formidable than one. The number multiplies fear. It also creates symmetry. If there are 7 gates to the underworld and 7 judges, then 7 destructive spirits mirror that cosmic layering. Structure is preserved even in harm. The Sebetu are sometimes portrayed as children of a higher deity, though accounts vary. In some traditions they are connected to Anu or to underworld authority. Their origin stories differ across periods, which indicates fluidity rather than fixed doctrine. What remains consistent is their collective identity. Unlike solitary spirits, the Sebetu move as a group. This group identity reinforces the idea of coordinated affliction. Illness spreading through a household, epidemic sweeping a city, or disaster striking multiple individuals at once could be framed as collective assault. 7 destructive spirits acting together provide narrative coherence for widespread suffering. The repetition of 7 also appears in ritual countermeasures. 7 figurines might be crafted, 7 incantations recited, 7 knots tied in protective cords. The number that symbolises harm also structures defence. Mesopotamian ritual logic often mirrored threat with symmetry. If 7 spirits afflict, 7 acts repel. The connection between the Sebetu and atmospheric disturbance is strong. They are sometimes described as storm demons, bringing wind and destruction. This aligns with earlier imagery of harmful forces descending from mountains or riding wind. The difference lies in scale. An Utukku might afflict an individual, the Sebetu might devastate a region. Yet in some texts the distinction blurs. The exorcist does not hesitate to command both away in the same formula. This suggests that categories overlapped functionally. It is possible that over time the Sebetu became emblematic of concentrated destructive power, while the Utukku remained a more general term for harmful spirits. Both occupy the tier beneath the great gods. Neither challenges the authority of the Anunnaki. Both operate within the cosmos. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, chaotic forces are subdued and ordered by Marduk. While the Sebetu do not play a central role in that narrative, the theme of chaotic multiplicity controlled by divine authority echoes in how destructive spirits are handled. They are not annihilated permanently, they are contained. The pattern of 7 reinforces containment through symmetry. When the Ashipu recites incantations listing the 7, he names them as a set. Naming a set implies boundaries. 7 also carries ritual weight in purification practices, 7 days of cleansing, 7 repetitions of formula. The rhythm of repetition creates psychological reinforcement. In a society attentive to cycles, 7 was natural. The fear associated with the Sebetu intensified the sense that harmful spirits could operate collectively. In modern interpretation, it is tempting to collapse all destructive spirits into a single category labelled demon. The tablets resist that simplification. They differentiate, they list, they specify. The Utukku and the Sebetu are distinct but sometimes adjacent. The presence of 7 destructive spirits in incantation literature highlights the structured nature of Mesopotamian fear. Even terror is organised. When an epidemic struck, the narrative could accommodate multiple agents acting in unison. The Sebetu provided that image, yet the ritual response remained consistent with hierarchy. The Ashipu invoked higher gods, authority flowed downward. Even 7 destructive spirits could be commanded by divine name. The repetition of 7 underscores a broader truth about Mesopotamian spirituality. Patterns mattered, numbers mattered, symmetry mattered. Spirits did not operate randomly in imagination. They followed conceptual structure. Understanding the Sebetu clarifies how destructive forces were imagined not as solitary anomalies, but as patterned presences within the cosmic system. It also raises questions about overlap between spirit categories. Were some Utukku counted among the 7? Were the Sebetu a specialized form of Utukku? The tablets do not always provide neat distinctions. Fluidity persists. As exorcistic literature expanded, speculation about origins also grew. If certain destructive spirits operated beneath the Anunnaki, if some descended from mountains and others rose from underworld, one might ask whether they were ever part of higher divine ranks, whether they represented degraded forms of once lofty beings. Such speculation appears in later interpretive traditions and modern theories alike, leading to the idea that perhaps some of these spirits were connected to another class of divine labourers described in Mesopotamian myth, the Igigi, whose own story of rebellion and subordination invites comparison. In the preserved tablets of Mesopotamia, categories are usually presented without apology. Gods are named, spirits are listed, ritual instructions are recorded, yet between those lines there are spaces where later interpreters have asked questions that the scribes themselves did not fully answer. One of those questions concerns origin. If the Utukku operated beneath the Anunnaki, if they were subordinate but active within the cosmic hierarchy, where did they come from? Were they created as they were, simply another class of spirit? Or did they descend from something else? Modern speculation has often turned toward the Igigi. The Igigi appear most prominently in the Atrahasis epic. In that account, they are divine labourers assigned to dig canals and perform heavy work for the greater gods. After years of toil, they rebel. They surround the house of Enlil in protest. The crisis leads to the creation of humanity, who are fashioned to take over the labour. The Igigi are not demons in that story. They are divine beings with grievance. Their rebellion is political, not moral. After humanity is created, the Igigi fade into the background of myth. The question arises because of structural similarity. The Igigi are beneath the Anunnaki in rank. The Utukku are also beneath the Anunnaki. The Igigi are capable of disobedience. The Utukku are associated with harm. Could there be a connection? The tablets themselves do not explicitly state that the Utukku are fallen Igigi. No preserved cuneiform line declares that rebellious divine labourers were transformed into harmful spirits. Yet the layered cosmology invites comparison. In Mesopotamian thought, divine hierarchy is clear but not static. Roles shift across myths. Certain gods rise in prominence over time. Marduk, for instance, ascends in status in the Enuma Elish. If divine rank could change, perhaps some lesser beings could also shift status. However, caution is necessary. The Igigi and Atrahasis are not portrayed as exiled or punished into demonic form. Their rebellion leads to negotiation. Humanity is created as compromise. The Igigi are not cast down to underworld or turned into roaming afflictors. The Utukku, by contrast, appear in ritual literature without narrative of prior divine standing. Still, the structural echo remains intriguing. Both categories occupy lower tiers beneath the Anunnaki. Both interact indirectly with humanity. Both function within the cosmic administration rather than outside it. Later traditions outside Mesopotamia introduce the idea of fallen watchers, or rebellious heavenly beings becoming demons. The watchers in certain Jewish texts are described as descending to earth and corrupting humanity. That narrative has sometimes been retroactively projected onto Mesopotamian material. But projection is not evidence. Within Mesopotamian sources, the Igigi are not morally condemned. They are labourers seeking relief. Their rebellion is resolved through creative adjustment. The Utukku, meanwhile, are described as harmful spirits requiring exorcism. The functional difference is significant. It is more consistent with available evidence to see the Utukku as a separate class of spirits rather than degraded former gods. Yet the question persists because Mesopotamian cosmology includes multiple tiers of beings, whose origins are not fully explained. Some spirits are described as children of specific gods. Others are listed without genealogy. The absence of explicit origin stories for the Utukku leaves room for speculation. There is also the possibility that different traditions were blended over centuries. Mesopotamian religion was not monolithic. It evolved across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian periods. Myths were reinterpreted. Names shifted. Roles merged. It is conceivable that some strands of belief connected harmful spirits to earlier divine classes, even if surviving tablets do not preserve that connection clearly. However, from a textual standpoint, the Utukku appear primarily in incantation series, not epic narrative. Their presence is functional rather than mythological. They exist to explain affliction and to structure ritual response. The Igigi exist within a myth explaining the origin of humanity and divine labour distribution. Different narrative domains. There is also a theological distinction. The Igigi are divine beings with voice and agency. They assemble, complain, and negotiate. The Utukku, as described in Incantations, do not speak independently in preserved narrative. They are addressed, commanded, and expelled. This suggests difference in ontological status. The temptation to identify the Utukku as fallen Igigi may arise from modern narrative preference for stories of descent and corruption. Such stories are powerful. They provide dramatic origin. Mesopotamian religion did not prioritize that kind of dramatic moral fall. Instead, it prioritized structure. Spirits exist. Gods exist. Humans exist. Each has place. The Utukku do not need a prior divine rebellion to justify their role. They fit within the layered cosmos as agents of imbalance. Still, exploring the question highlights something important. The Utukku were not imagined as equal to the Anunnaki. They were beneath. That placement creates narrative space for speculation about whether they once held higher rank. But absence of evidence in preserved text suggests caution. The more grounded interpretation remains that the Utukku were a class of spirits from the beginning, perhaps associated with liminal zones, perhaps tied to atmospheric or underworld forces, but not explicitly derived from rebellious gods. Their power was limited. They were formidable at the level of individual suffering, but not at the level of cosmic governance. The Igigi's story serves to emphasize divine hierarchy and the creation of humanity. The Utukku's story serves to explain illness and ritual intervention, different functions within the same cosmos. What is undeniable is that as exorcistic literature expanded, the harmful nature of certain Utukku became more sharply defined. The phrase Utukkulem Nutu appears repeatedly, solidifying the image of the evil Utukku as a specific threat. Understanding how that phrase shaped perception requires closer examination of the literary construction of the evil Utukku itself, the one that walks at night, afflicts without warning, and became the dominant image in ritual practice. By the time the great libraries of Assyria were assembled, particularly the collection at Nineveh under Ashurbanipal, the phrase Utukku Lemnutu had become firmly embedded in ritual literature. The words direct: Utukku, the spirit; Lemnutu, the evil. Together they form a designation that leaves little ambiguity in tone. Whatever earlier flexibility the term may once have held, the preserved exorcistic tablets focus heavily on this harmful manifestation. The Utukku Lemnutu is not described as majestic. It is not given mythic genealogy and epic form. Instead, it is portrayed through effect. It afflicts the body. It stalks at night. It enters houses without invitation. It seizes limbs, clouds thought, and produces suffering. The emphasis on nighttime is deliberate. Darkness in Mesopotamia carried practical danger. Without artificial lighting, night transformed familiar streets into uncertain corridors. Movement was limited. Visibility vanished. The boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. Many incantations against the Utukku Lemnutu reference nocturnal activity. The spirit approaches after sunset. It disturbs sleep. It presses upon the chest. It causes fever to rise in the quiet hours. The association between night and vulnerability reinforced the spirit's menace. The texts often describe the evil Utukku as roaming silently. It has no mouth, yet it cries out. It has no ears, yet it hears. These paradoxical descriptions remove clear physical form. The spirit is defined by action, not anatomy. In this way, the Utukku Lemnutu becomes less a creature and more a force. The exorcistic series dedicated to confronting it are extensive. Modern scholars refer to a long ritual compilation as the Utukku Lemnutu series, consisting of multiple tablets that catalogue incantations and procedures. The length of the series suggests recurring fear. These tablets do not narrate origin stories. They prescribe responses. They instruct the Ashipu on how to identify the presence of the evil Utukku and how to remove it. The language is urgent but structured. The spirit is commanded to leave the body and return to steppe, mountain or underworld. The ritual sometimes includes washing, fumigation, and placement of protective objects. The Utukku Lemnutu is portrayed as invasive. It does not respect thresholds. It enters through doorways, windows, cracks in walls. Such imagery reflects architectural reality. Mud brick houses were durable but permeable. Night wind passed through small openings. The spirit moved as easily as air. The phrase, walked at night, is not metaphorical in the modern literary sense. It reflects lived fear of what cannot be seen but can be felt. Sleep disturbances would have been common. Fever dreams, night terrors, and episodes of sleep paralysis all align closely with descriptions found in incantation texts. The sensation of pressure on the chest, inability to move, and perception of presence in the room are experiences still reported today. Without neurological explanation, the Utukku Lemnutu provided structure. In some incantations, the evil Utukku is described as following the afflicted person, shadowing them, waiting for weakness. This personalization intensifies anxiety. The spirit is not random, it targets. Yet even in these descriptions, hierarchy remains intact. The exorcist invokes higher authority. The evil Utukku is addressed as subordinate. It is not defiant, it is compelled. The ritual language often includes threats of divine punishment if the spirit does not depart. Shamash is called as witness. Ea is invoked for purification. The evil Utukku is reminded of its place. This repetition reinforces cosmological order. The incantations sometimes include lists of multiple harmful beings alongside the Utukku Lemnutu. The Ashipu ensures that no possible afflictor remains unaddressed. But the evil Utukku stands out as a recurrent category. Its prominence in ritual literature may reflect practical frequency. Illness and nighttime fear were common. a spirit associated with those experiences would naturally appear often in records. The word evil in this context does not imply absolute metaphysical wickedness. It indicates harm to human well-being and disruption of balance. The spirit's role is defined by outcome. Descriptions of the Utukku Lemnutu emphasize stealth. It approaches silently. It leaves without being seen. It causes harm without visible wound. In a world without microscopic understanding, such stealth seemed supernatural. There are also hints of social dimension. A person afflicted repeatedly might be suspected of ritual impurity or neglect of offerings. The spirit's persistence could signal imbalance in relationship with gods. Thus, the evil Utukku functioned not only as explanation for illness, but as reinforcement of religious discipline. If proper ritual practice repelled spirits, then maintaining that practice became urgent. The Utukku Lemnutu's literary construction solidified the harmful image of the Utukku category. Over centuries, this repeated association overshadowed earlier dual references to good Utukku. Language narrowed identity. Yet even at its most menacing, the evil Utukku remains within system. It does not overthrow divine authority. It operates beneath. The Ashipu's confidence in ritual expulsion shows that the spirit's power is limited. Night may belong temporarily to fear, but dawn restores clarity. Shamash, the sun god, dispels darkness. Invoking him in incantations symbolically aligns ritual with sunrise. Light pushes back unseen threat. The repeated confrontation of the Utukku Lemnutu in ritual texts demonstrates how deeply embedded the concept became in Mesopotamian daily life. Fear of invisible affliction required continuous management, and when nighttime affliction blended with dreams, when the boundary between waking and sleeping thinned further, the role of spirits in dream invasion became even more pronounced, leading to interpretations of certain sleep phenomena that align closely with modern descriptions of paralysis and night terror. When night settled over the mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia, it did not simply dim the landscape, it changed the rules. The heat of the day faded. The lamps were lit briefly, then extinguished to preserve oil. Conversations quieted. Families lay down on woven mats or low beds. Outside, wind moved through narrow streets. Dogs barked. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. And inside that darkness, the boundary between the waking world and the unseen thinned. Dreams were not considered random mental noise. They were messages, omens, communications from gods, warnings from the future, or disturbances from spirits. Entire collections of tablets were devoted to dream interpretation. If a person dreamed of falling, of water, of a dead relative speaking, the dream could be catalogued and assigned meaning. But not all nocturnal experiences were symbolic visions. Some were terrifying. Descriptions preserved in exorcistic texts align strikingly with what modern medicine calls sleep paralysis. The afflicted person wakes but cannot move. There is pressure on the chest. Breathing feels constricted. A presence seems to be in the room. Fear intensifies. The episode passes, but the memory lingers. Without neurological explanation, such an event demanded interpretation. The Utukku provided one. In incantation texts, the evil Utukku is described as approaching at night, seizing the body, pressing upon limbs, clouding the mind. The language is physical. The spirit lies upon the afflicted. It binds muscles. It holds the throat. These descriptions are not poetic exaggeration. They reflect experiential fear. In a culture that already accepted that spirits could enter the body and cause illness, nighttime immobility fit naturally into the same framework. The body became vulnerable during sleep. Conscious defences were lowered. If a harmful Utukku roamed the night, that was the moment of opportunity. The association between night and spirit intrusion appears repeatedly. Incantations are timed specifically for nighttime performance. Lamps may be lit. Protective amulets placed near the bed. Water for purification kept within reach. The bedroom was not merely a place of rest. It was a potential threshold. Dream invasion extended beyond paralysis. Recurring nightmares could be attributed to spirits. If a person dreamed of being chased, attacked, or suffocated, the Ashipu might diagnose spirit involvement. Dreams were interpreted according to pattern. A single nightmare might not indicate invasion. Repetition, intensity, and accompanying physical symptoms increased suspicion. The concept of a spirit entering dreams fits within broader Mesopotamian cosmology. Dreams were one of the channels through which gods communicated. If divine beings could use that channel, so too could lesser spirits. The Utukku in this context is not always depicted as speaking. It does not deliver prophecy. It afflicts through presence. The psychological effect is clear. Fear experienced during paralysis would reinforce belief in invasion. If the afflicted person reported sensing a weight on the chest or a shadow near the bed, the narrative of an Utukku became persuasive. Even today, many cultures interpret sleep paralysis through spiritual frameworks. The human experience is universal. The explanation is cultural. Mesopotamian exorcistic texts include formulas specifically aimed at nocturnal affliction. The spirit is commanded to depart before dawn. Shamash, the sun god, is invoked as witness to dispel darkness. Dawn carried relief. Light restored normal boundaries. Night blurred them. There are also references in some texts to spirits whispering or speaking during dreams. The afflicted might hear voices or receive commands. Such auditory hallucinations could be interpreted as the work of a roaming Utukku. The Ashipu's response involved purification rituals at sunrise. Water was poured. Incantations were spoken. The afflicted might be instructed to avoid certain activities temporarily. These measures were not random. They restored a sense of agency. The idea that a spirit had invaded during sleep could be countered by ritual cleansing. In this framework, the Utukku becomes deeply personal. It is not a distant storm rider or underworld emissary. It is something that can enter the most private space. The bed is intimate. The body at rest is defenseless. To experience paralysis and attribute it to a spirit created a coherent narrative that did not depend on internal malfunction. The fault was external. External fault can be expelled. The recurrence of nighttime imagery in Utukku literature also reflects practical vulnerability. Night limited visibility and protection. Watchmen guarded city gates, but households guarded themselves. Protective figurines were often placed near sleeping areas. Amulets inscribed with divine names were worn overnight. This suggests that fear of nocturnal spirits was widespread enough to influence domestic practice. Dream interpretation texts from sites like Nineveh list symbolic meanings for dream content, but exorcistic texts address harmful experiences directly. The distinction reveals two strands of thought: symbolic communication and invasive affliction. The Utukku belongs primarily to the latter, yet the overlap between dream symbolism and spirit invasion complicates matters. A nightmare could be interpreted both as omen and as attack. The Ashipu had to discern which applied. This diagnostic nuance reinforces the sophistication of the system. Sleep paralysis is not the only nocturnal phenomenon described. Fever often rose at night. Pain intensified in stillness. Children cried more frequently after dark. All of these patterns reinforced the association between night and vulnerability. The evil Utukku, already described as walking at night, fit neatly into that pattern. It is important to recognize that these beliefs were not irrational within their context. They were structured attempts to map unexplained experience onto a layered cosmology. The body at night became a battlefield not only of illness, but of perception. The Mesopotamian response was not resignation, it was ritual action. Understanding dream invasion clarifies how deeply integrated the Utukku were into daily life. They were not confined to mythic narrative. They were present in the bedroom, in the silence between breaths, and as fear of intrusion shaped domestic practice, architecture itself began to reflect spiritual defense, with temples and household layouts designed not only for worship and shelter, but also as barriers against unseen forces that might otherwise slip through the night. In ancient Mesopotamia, architecture was never neutral. Walls did not merely divide space, they defined order. Thresholds were not simple doorways. They were lines between controlled interior and uncertain exterior. In a world where invisible forces were believed to move through wind, night, and dream, buildings became more than shelter. They became defences. The temple stood at the centre of that defensive system. Cities such as Uruk, Ur, and Babylon were organised around sacred complexes. The temple was not only a religious site, it was administrative, economic, and symbolic. It embodied divine presence in physical form. If spirits like the Utukku represented intrusion and imbalance, then sacred architecture represented stability. Ziggurats rose in stepped layers, lifting the sanctuary above ground level. The elevation was practical and symbolic. Height separated sacred space from ordinary terrain. It also implied distance from underworld forces. The verticality mattered. Heaven above, underworld below. The temple stood between. Within temple walls, ritual purity was maintained carefully. Access was controlled. Offerings were regulated. Incantations were performed according to calendar. The space was ordered in contrast to the unpredictability beyond its perimeter. This order was not aesthetic alone. It was protective. Protective spirits were installed at thresholds. Carved figures of guardian beings flanked entrances. These figures were not decoration. They were spiritual sentries. Even household architecture reflected similar logic. Doorways were reinforced symbolically. Clay plaques bearing protective inscriptions were embedded in walls. Amulets were buried beneath foundations. The idea was clear. Spirits approached from outside. Barriers were required. The Utukku, described as entering houses silently, would encounter these layered defences. Temples functioned as more than passive sanctuaries. They were ritual fortresses. Inside, the Ashipu and other priests performed purification rites not only for individuals but for the city as a whole. If plague threatened, ritual response occurred at temple level. The architecture amplified authority. A spirit might afflict a single person in a private home, but it could not easily invade the sanctified heart of the city. The temple complex often included courtyards, inner chambers, storage rooms, and altars. Each zone carried specific function. Movement through these spaces followed ritual progression. This ordered movement mirrored cosmic hierarchy. If the Utukku symbolized imbalance and boundary violation, then temple design reasserted boundary clarity. The physical solidity of mud brick walls reinforced psychological security. Even though spirits were believed capable of invisibility, the presence of sacred space strengthened communal confidence. Sacred architecture also embodied divine ownership. The city belonged to its patron deity. To invade it spiritually was to trespass on divine property. Ritual texts sometimes emphasize that the afflicted person is under the protection of a specific god. That logic scales upward. The city itself is under protection of its temple god. In Babylon, the Esagila temple dedicated to Marduk symbolized central authority. In Ur, the ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god, anchored sacred geography. These structures were not merely places of worship, they were cosmic anchors. The presence of divine statues within temples reinforced containment. The statue was believed to embody divine presence. A spirit like the Utukku would not approach casually into such concentrated authority. The temple thus functioned as both physical and spiritual barrier. This barrier extended beyond city centres. Boundary stones, protective inscriptions, and ritual deposits marked edges of settlements. Mesopotamian belief was attentive to liminality. The edge of a field, the entrance to a house, the border of a city, these were vulnerable points. Architecture reinforced those points. The ritual burial of figurines beneath doorways is particularly telling. Figurines representing protective spirits were placed strategically to intercept harmful forces. If an Utukku moved with wind, the doorway was its path. If it emerged from ground, the foundation was its root. Every architectural element could become part of spiritual defense. Temples also served as centers for diagnosing and treating spiritual affliction. The afflicted were brought into sacred space for purification. The act of entering temple grounds symbolized re-entry into order. The architecture itself reinforced the narrative of restoration. Even the orientation of temples mattered. Many were aligned with cardinal directions or celestial events. Alignment integrated sacred space with cosmic order. The more tightly integrated a structure was with cosmic pattern, the stronger its symbolic defense. Sacred space was not isolated from daily life. Markets, administrative offices and storage facilities were often adjacent to temple complexes. The temple's authority radiated outward. In times of crisis, collective rituals were performed to ward off widespread affliction. The city gathered under divine protection. The Utukku, though feared, did not possess equal spatial authority. They roamed margins, ruins, wilderness. They did not have temples. This distinction underscores hierarchy. The Anunnaki and major gods were institutionalized. The Utukku were managed. Sacred architecture thus becomes visible theology. It expresses in brick and stone what ritual texts express in words. There is also an element of psychological reassurance. In a world where invisible forces were believed active, the sight of monumental architecture offered tangible stability. The temple did not eliminate fear, it contextualized it. The existence of layered defences, architectural, ritual, symbolic, demonstrates that the Mesopotamian world did not resign itself to spiritual vulnerability. It built against it. And yet, the very need for such defences implies an ongoing negotiation between categories. Spirits like the Utukku were neither entirely separate from divine authority nor fully integrated into it. They occupied an ambiguous space. That ambiguity leads naturally to a deeper question about classification itself. If the Utukku could afflict but also be commanded, if they were beneath gods but more active than ghosts, where exactly did the line fall between god and demon? And was that line as clear to the Mesopotamians as later traditions would assume? As sacred walls rose and incantations multiplied, a deeper issue remained quietly unresolved beneath the surface of Mesopotamian belief. Spirits like the Utukku could afflict, yet they could be commanded. They were feared, yet they were not ultimate enemies of the cosmos. They moved beneath the great gods, but they were not entirely separate from divine structure. This raises a structural tension that ancient texts never fully resolve in explicit philosophical terms, but constantly navigate in practice. Where exactly did the line fall between a god and a demon? In modern religious vocabulary, that line is sharp. A god is worthy of worship. A demon is an adversary. One commands reverence. The other demands resistance. But that binary belongs to later theological systems shaped by strict moral dualism. The Mesopotamian cosmos was organized differently. Power determined rank, not morality alone. Major gods ruled domains and received offerings. Lesser gods performed narrower functions. Spirits operated at lower tiers. Harmful spirits disrupted order, but did not overthrow it. The difference between divine and demonic was often a matter of authority and scale rather than moral polarity. Consider the great gods themselves. Enlil could send famine. Ishtar could unleash destruction upon cities. Nergal was associated with plague and war. These deities were not gentle abstractions. They wielded force, yet they were not classified as demons. They were sovereign within their domains. When a god caused harm, it was framed as judgment, correction, or expression of divine will. When a spirit like an Utukku caused harm, it was framed as intrusion or imbalance. The effect on the human body might look similar. Fever is fever, whether attributed to divine displeasure or spirit invasion. The difference lies in hierarchy. Gods ruled, spirits acted beneath. This hierarchy complicates modern attempts to categorize the Utukku strictly as demons in the later sense. They were harmful, yes, but they were not independent rivals to divine authority. They were agents operating within a layered cosmos. The line between god and demon was therefore not drawn at the level of destructive capacity. It was drawn at the level of rank and legitimacy. Legitimacy came from institutional recognition. Gods had temples, they had priesthoods, they had established cults and mythic narratives that reinforced their authority. Spirits like the Utukku did not possess temples. They were not worshipped. They were addressed only in defensive ritual. This difference in cultic status mattered deeply. If a being received offerings in gratitude and praise, it was recognized as divine. If a being was confronted only through exorcism and warding, it occupied a lower adversarial tier. Yet even this distinction is not absolute. Certain spirits that might appear fearsome could also be invoked protectively in specific contexts. The boundaries were flexible. Moreover, the Mesopotamian understanding of divine anger blurs moral clarity. A city destroyed by a god storm was not experiencing demonic invasion. It was experiencing divine will. From the human perspective, destruction still occurred. The difference lay in interpretation. A god's destructive act was meaningful within cosmic governance. A spirit's destructive act was a localized disturbance, perspective-shaped classification. Another layer of complexity emerges when examining language itself. The Akkadian term, often translated as demon, does not always carry the same connotations that the English word suggests. It refers to a type of spirit, not necessarily an embodiment of absolute evil. When modern readers encounter the word demon, centuries of later theology colour interpretation. Horned figures, rebellion, and moral opposition come to mind. Mesopotamian texts do not describe the Utukku in that way. They are rarely depicted with consistent physical form. They do not wage cosmic war. They do not seek to dethrone the Anunnaki. They afflict individuals. They disturb households. They move through margins. Their power is practical, not metaphysical in the grand sense. There is also the question of divine ambiguity. Some beings straddle categories. Hybrid figures, such as protective guardian spirits, possess both terrifying and benevolent aspects. They may appear monstrous in form, yet serve as defenders of sacred space. This demonstrates that appearance alone does not define status. Similarly, destructive capacity does not automatically reduce a being to demonic rank. Gods could devastate. Spirits could harm. The key distinction lies in recognized authority. The Mesopotamian cosmos was administrative. Divine council scenes in myth show gods deliberating, assigning roles and determining fates. The underworld had its own structured rulership. Even the dead were governed. Spirits like the Utukku fit into this bureaucracy. They did not legislate, they executed. If a person fell ill, the exorcist did not attempt to overthrow the spirit through rebellion. He appealed upward. He invoked divine names. Authority flowed downward to command the lesser being. This dynamic reinforces perspective. From above, the Utukku are manageable. From below, they are terrifying. For the individual suffering paralysis at night, the distinction between god and demon might feel irrelevant. Pain is immediate. Fear is visceral. For the ritual specialist, classification matters. The fact that spirits can be commanded demonstrates their subordinate position. At the same time, the fact that gods can cause destruction complicates simplistic moral frameworks. A god who sends plague is not demoted to demonic status. Instead, his action is contextualized within divine governance. This suggests that Mesopotamian religion did not divide beings according to moral purity. It divided them according to domain and authority. The line between god and demon is therefore perspectival. From the standpoint of cosmic hierarchy, a god occupies a defined office with recognized worship. A demon or harmful spirit occupies a lower tier, lacking temple and cult. From the standpoint of the lived experience, both can cause suffering. This perspective also explains why spirits like the Utukku were not central antagonists in epic narratives. Epics focus on gods, kings, and heroic journeys. Harmful spirits operate at a different narrative level. They belong to ritual, not epic. Their absence from grand myth does not indicate insignificance, it indicates function. The line is further blurred by the fact that some gods possess terrifying attributes that resemble later demonic imagery. Fierce deities associated with plague, war, and death wield imagery that modern audiences might label demonic. Yet in Mesopotamia, they remained legitimate. Legitimacy, again, defines the boundary. The Utukku lacked institutional legitimacy. They had no dedicated priesthood advocating their worship. They were never praised for creative acts or cosmic victories. They were named in order to be expelled. Still, even in expulsion, they are treated as participants in the system rather than existential threats to it. The exorcist does not deny their existence. He acknowledges it. He commands them by appealing to higher order. The lack of absolute dualism in Mesopotamian thought means that the boundary between divine and demonic is more about function than moral opposition. This fluidity challenges modern readers accustomed to clear categories. It also explains why later religious traditions, emerging in regions influenced by Mesopotamian cosmology, could reinterpret certain spirits in new moral frameworks. As belief systems shifted towards sharper dualism, spirits once seen as subordinate agents could be recast as cosmic adversaries. But in their original context, the Utukku remained beneath the Anunnaki, neither equal nor revolutionary. Understanding this line as perspectival rather than absolute prepares us to examine how these ancient categories echoed into later traditions, how concepts of roaming harmful spirits migrated and transformed as cultures changed, and how the shadow of the Utukku may have lingered far beyond the mud-brick cities where their names were first pressed into clay. When civilizations shift, ideas rarely disappear. They travel, they change language, they adapt to new theological systems. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia were buried for centuries, but the conceptual frameworks they carried did not vanish as easily as their script. Between the rivers of Sumer and the later religious landscapes of the Near East, echoes persisted. Spirits that roamed at night, forces that afflicted bodies, beings that descended from above or rose from below. These ideas did not remain confined to Akkadian incantations. As Mesopotamian influence spread through trade, conquest and exile, so too did its cosmology. The Assyrian and Babylonian empires extended power across the Levant. During the Neo-Babylonian period, deportations carried populations, including the Judeans, into Mesopotamian territory. Cultural exchange was not optional, it was structural. Within that exchange, older Mesopotamian categories met emerging monotheistic frameworks. In Mesopotamian belief, spirits like the Utukku operated beneath the Anunnaki. They were subordinate agents of disturbance. They did not challenge divine order. They functioned within it. In later Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly texts such as the Book of Enoch, a different narrative emerges. There, a group known as the Watchers descends from heaven, interacts improperly with humanity, and becomes the source of corruption and suffering. These beings are described as having fallen from higher status. The resemblance is not one-to-one, but structural parallels invite attention. Both systems imagine tiers of beings beneath the highest divine authority. Both describe harmful forces associated with descent. Both situate affliction within a cosmic hierarchy. The difference lies in moral framing. In Mesopotamia, harmful spirits were not usually portrayed as rebellious former gods. They were functional agents within structured order. In apocalyptic Jewish literature, the Watchers become examples of disobedience, and their fall introduces moral dualism more sharply. This shift reflects theological evolution. Where Mesopotamian cosmology allowed for layered administration without cosmic rebellion, later monotheistic systems increasingly emphasize singular divine sovereignty and moral opposition. Spirits once seen as subordinate agents could be reinterpreted as adversarial. The exile period likely intensified this transformation. When Judean elites encountered Babylonian religion firsthand, they encountered not only temples and ziggurats, but also incantation practices, layered divine hierarchies, and structured spirit categories. Exposure to these ideas did not mean direct adoption, but influence through contrast and reinterpretation is historically plausible. The concept of nocturnal affliction, for instance, persists in later traditions. Sleep paralysis and nighttime oppression appear in folklore across cultures. In later Jewish and Christian thought, such experiences are sometimes attributed to demonic visitation. The mechanism remains similar. The explanatory structure changes. The Utukku Lemnutu walking at night becomes, in later imagination, a demon or unclean spirit. The hierarchical structure shifts from polytheistic layering to moralized opposition between god and adversary. The Watcher's narrative introduces another element, fall from heaven. In Mesopotamian texts, the Utukku are not described as expelled from divine council, they are simply present within the system. But the idea that beings beneath the highest god could descend and cause harm resonates with earlier cosmological tiers. It is possible that the conceptual space once occupied by subordinate spirits like the Utukku made it easier for later writers to imagine fallen intermediaries. Intermediary beings are common in ancient Near Eastern religion. Another echo appears in the broader Near Eastern concept of desert spirits. Harmful entities associated with wilderness, ruins, and night appear in Hebrew prophetic literature. References to creatures inhabiting desolate places carry faint memory of earlier Mesopotamian spatial symbolism. The wilderness remained a place of vulnerability. In both systems, harmful forces dwell outside cultivated order. Yet there is an important difference. Mesopotamian religion did not center on a cosmic battle between good and evil in the later sense. The Utukku did not represent metaphysical opposition to divine will. They represented imbalance within divine governance. As monotheism sharpened, the moral dimension intensified. Harmful spirits were increasingly portrayed as enemies of God rather than instruments within structured hierarchy. The administrative tone of Mesopotamian cosmology softened into narrative drama. Even so, the idea that illness could be caused by unseen agents persisted. Exorcism remained a practice in Jewish and later Christian contexts. Invocation of divine authority to command harmful spirits mirrors earlier Ashipu rituals. The method echoes even if theology shifts. It is also worth noting that Mesopotamian incantation traditions influenced magical and protective texts across the Near East. Aramaic incantation bowls, for example, used in late antiquity, contain inscriptions designed to trap harmful spirits. These bowls, often buried upside down beneath thresholds, reflect continuity of protective logic. The material changes, the structure persists. The Utukku may not be named explicitly in later traditions, but the template of roaming harmful spirits remains active. Even Islamic folklore includes jinn associated with desolate spaces, wind and night. While jinn belong to a distinct theological system, the pattern of invisible beings inhabiting marginal zones parallels earlier Mesopotamian spatial imagination. Cultural transmission is rarely linear. It is layered and adaptive. The Watchers in apocalyptic literature represent a dramatic reframing. Rather than subordinate agents within hierarchy, they become rebellious intermediaries whose fall introduces moral disorder. The transformation reflects shifting emphasis from administrative cosmos to moralized narrative. Still, beneath the narrative shift, one can detect structural continuity, tiers of beings, descent, harm to humanity, invocation of higher authority. The Utukku's legacy may therefore lie less in direct textual inheritance and more in conceptual architecture. The idea that unseen beings operate between heaven and earth, capable of afflicting individuals yet subordinate to ultimate divine authority, is not unique to Mesopotamia. But Mesopotamia provides one of the earliest preserved expressions of that architecture. Over time, as theological frameworks evolved, the interpretation of such beings changed. Spirits once understood as functional parts of cosmic administration could be recast as adversaries in moral drama. Yet the older structure lingers quietly beneath. Understanding these echoes clarifies that the Utukku were not isolated curiosities of ancient religion. They were part of a broader Near Eastern conversation about hierarchy, vulnerability, and the unseen. And even as their image shifted across centuries, one question remains consistent. Were these spirits purely objects of fear, or were they in some sense manageable, integrated into the system as forces to be negotiated rather than annihilated? A possibility that brings us back to how Mesopotamians themselves related to them in daily life. By the time the incantation tablets were compiled in royal libraries and temple archives, the image of the Utukku as a harmful spirit was firmly established. The evil Utukku walked at night, pressed upon the body, entered through cracks, and disturbed sleep. The language of ritual addressed it directly and without hesitation. It was not invited, it was expelled. And yet, the tone of those rituals is revealing. The Ashipu does not scream in panic. He does not describe the Utukku as unstoppable. He speaks with authority. He names the spirit. He commands it. He invokes higher divine power and expects compliance. This posture suggests something important. The Utukku were feared, certainly, but they were also managed. Fear alone produces paralysis. Management produces system. Mesopotamian religion did not operate on resignation. It operated on response. If a spirit could afflict, then a ritual could confront. If a boundary could be crossed, then it could be reinforced. The very existence of standardized exorcistic series preserved across centuries demonstrates confidence in containment. In diagnostic texts, symptoms are listed with precision: trembling, fever, delirium, persistent nightmares. Each could indicate spirit involvement, but the listing is clinical. It reflects analysis rather than chaos. The spirit is a variable in a system, not an unstoppable catastrophe. When the evil Utukku is addressed in incantation, it is reminded of hierarchy. It is told that the afflicted person belongs to a god. It is commanded to depart to desert, mountain, or underworld. The ritual does not beg, it orders. This suggests that the Utukku were not seen as autonomous cosmic rivals. They were subordinate actors capable of harm but constrained by authority. Management required structure. Protective amulets were worn daily. Clay figurines were buried at thresholds. Sacred names were inscribed on walls. These were preventative measures, not emergency improvisations. If fear had been absolute, such measures would feel futile. Instead, they were routine. The Mesopotamian worldview integrated harmful spirits into daily life. They were expected possibilities, not apocalyptic disruptions. Even the language of evil in Utukku Lemnutu is functional. The spirit is harmful because it disrupts balance. It is not metaphysically evil in opposition to the gods. This functional understanding allows management. There is also a social dimension. Illness attributed to an Utukku did not necessarily imply moral condemnation of the afflicted. The spirit could strike unexpectedly. The ritual restored balance without permanent stigma. This preserves communal cohesion. If a child became sick, the response was ritual and treatment, not ostracism. The Utukku thus functioned within a manageable cosmology. The temple played its role. The Ashipu played his role. The afflicted family participated in prescribed actions. Fear was structured. There are instances in ritual texts where the spirit is not only expelled but redirected. It is sent back to its proper domain. The language emphasizes restoration of order rather than annihilation. Return to where you belong. This phrasing reflects a worldview that does not seek to eradicate all harmful forces permanently. It seeks to maintain boundaries. Mesopotamian religion did not imagine a final cosmic victory over all spirits. It imagined ongoing balance. The existence of harmful spirits was not seen as a flaw in the universe. It was part of its layered complexity. Management extended beyond exorcism. Daily offerings, adherence to ritual calendars, and respect for divine hierarchy all reinforced spiritual stability. Neglect of ritual could weaken protection. Thus, relationship with the Utukku was indirect but persistent. There is also evidence that certain spirits, while feared, were acknowledged as part of cosmic machinery. If a god permitted affliction, the spirit acted as instrument. The Ashipu might seek not only to expel the spirit, but to reconcile the afflicted person with divine authority. Management included appeasement. In this sense, the Utukku were not purely external enemies. They were components of divine governance that required negotiation. This negotiation does not remove fear. Nighttime affliction remained terrifying. Fever remained dangerous. The unpredictability of illness sustained anxiety, but anxiety was given procedural outlet. The difference between fear and management lies in control. The Mesopotamian ritual system provided control through structured action. Even the repetition of incantations reinforces this. A repeated formula becomes familiar. Familiarity reduces panic. The Utukku were integrated into cosmological expectation. It is also worth considering that the Utukku did not receive temples or cults. They were not worshipped to prevent harm. Instead, higher gods were invoked to counter them. This reinforces their subordinate status. If the Utukku had been viewed as independent sovereign threats, appeasement cults might have developed. The absence of such cults suggests that management was sufficient. Over centuries, as exorcistic literature expanded, the image of the harmful Utukku became more prominent in writing. But prominence in text does not necessarily equal dominance in lived reality. Ritual literature records crisis response. Everyday stability leaves fewer inscriptions. The balance between fear and management likely fluctuated depending on context. During epidemic or famine, fear would intensify. During stable periods, ritual maintenance may have felt sufficient. The key point remains that the Utukku existed within a cosmos that assumed order at the highest levels. The Anunnaki deliberated. Major gods ruled. The underworld had structure. Spirits operated beneath. Management flowed downward through invocation. Understanding this balance clarifies that the Utukku were neither dismissed nor exaggerated into cosmic adversaries. They were feared as forces of affliction, but contained within hierarchical logic. This containment leads to one final layer of inquiry. If the Utukku operated beneath the Anunnaki, if they were instruments within divine administration rather than rebels, then what purpose did they ultimately serve within that system, and why would such beings be necessary at all in a universe already governed by powerful gods? If the Utukku were not independent rebels, not cosmic rivals to the Anunnaki, and not accidental anomalies in the structure of the universe, then the question shifts quietly but inevitably. What purpose did they serve? In Mesopotamian thought, the universe was not random. It was administered. The Anunnaki deliberated. The great gods assigned domains. Even the underworld operated with officials and judges. Nothing meaningful occurred outside structure. Within that structure, harmful spirits like the Utukku appear repeatedly, consistently, and across centuries of text. They were not marginal footnotes. They were embedded in ritual systems, diagnostic manuals, and incantation series. Persistent presence implies function. One possible function is enforcement. In Mesopotamian theology, divine displeasure could manifest through illness, famine, or misfortune. When a person neglected offerings, violated oath, or disrupted ritual purity, consequences followed. Those consequences did not always arrive as visible divine intervention. They often arrived through mediated force. The Utukku may have served as such mediators. If a god determined that correction was necessary, a spirit could enact that correction at the level of the body. The harmful Utukku becomes less a rogue attacker and more an instrument. This aligns with ritual language that invokes higher gods to command the spirit. If the spirit operates under divine authority, it can be recalled or restrained by that authority. The logic is administrative. A king does not personally punish every subject. Officials carry out orders. In the divine hierarchy, spirits like the Utukku could fulfill analogous roles. Another possible function is maintenance of boundary. Mesopotamian cosmology emphasized thresholds. City walls marked civilization. Temple courts marked sacred ground. Night marked vulnerability. Life and death were separated by underworld descent. Spirits that moved across boundaries reinforced awareness of those boundaries. The fear of the Utukku encouraged vigilance. Households maintained protective amulets. Ritual purity was observed. Temple offerings were performed. In this sense, the Utukku indirectly supported religious discipline. Without the possibility of intrusion, ritual maintenance might have weakened. There is also the explanatory function. Human bodies fail, crops fail, storms arise. Without a framework, such failures feel chaotic. The Utukku provided narrative structure to unpredictable suffering. They did not eliminate fear, but they localized it. Instead of facing abstract randomness, individuals faced identifiable spirits. Identifiable spirits can be addressed. Addressable affliction is psychologically manageable. Thus, the Utukku served cognitive purpose. They translated biological and environmental vulnerability into cosmological terms. Another dimension involves balance. Mesopotamian religion did not present a universe of pure benevolence. It presented a universe of forces in equilibrium. Creation required tension. Order required the containment of disorder. Spirits like the Utukku may have represented controlled disorder. They introduced instability at manageable scale. If disorder were absent entirely, the system would lack contrast. If disorder were dominant, the system would collapse. The Utukku occupied a middle tier. They could harm individuals, perhaps households, but not overthrow cities or dethrone gods. Their scale was limited. This limitation suggests intentional placement within the hierarchy. The fact that exorcism rituals were effective within narrative logic implies that the system allowed for correction. Harm was not final. There is also a theological humility embedded here. If the gods alone determined every detail of affliction directly, then human appeal might feel futile. But if affliction came through spirits, then ritual negotiation could intervene. This creates space for interaction. The Ashipu's role gains meaning. The temple's authority is reinforced. The Utukku thus indirectly elevate the importance of ritual specialists. They justify professional exorcism. There may also be symbolic purpose tied to mortality. The underworld awaited all humans. Death was inevitable. Spirits associated with that realm, even if not identical to the Utukku, reminded the living of fragility. Affliction, as temporary brush with underworld presence, reinforced awareness of mortality. Awareness of mortality encourages piety. This does not imply that suffering was welcomed. It implies that suffering had place within structure. The Mesopotamian worldview did not eliminate pain. It contextualized it. Spirits like the Utukku, whether descending from mountains, riding wind, or rising from underworld shadow, embodied the thinness of the line between stability and collapse. Yet they remained beneath the Anunnaki. That subordination is crucial. If the Utukku served purpose, it was not autonomous purpose. It was functional within divine governance. The idea that harmful spirits serve higher order may feel unsettling. It challenges modern preference for clear antagonists. But in Mesopotamian cosmology, hierarchy supersedes moral absolutism. The Utukku were neither ultimate villains nor random chaos. They were agents of imbalance within balanced system. Their purpose may have been enforcement, boundary maintenance, explanation, or symbolic embodiment of vulnerability. Perhaps it was all of these. The enduring presence of the Utukku in ritual literature suggests that they were not theological accidents. They were necessary components of a worldview that sought to integrate fear without surrendering to it. And so the story of the Utukku does not end in rebellion or cosmic defeat. It settles into the quiet recognition that beneath the great thrones of the Anunnaki, beneath temple walls and structured incantations, forces moved that reminded humanity of fragility, of threshold, and of the constant negotiation between seen and unseen, a negotiation that lingers even now in the silent hours when the wind shifts and the world feels thinner than it did at noon. The cities of ancient Mesopotamia have long since fallen silent. The ziggurats are broken, the temple courts are dust. The names of kings that once echoed through stone corridors survive only in pressed clay and careful translation. And yet, some of the questions that shaped that world remain strangely familiar. What causes sudden illness? What moves in the night? Why does the body sometimes fail without warning? Why does fear rise in darkness and recede at dawn? The Utukku were one answer. They were not ultimate enemies of the cosmos. They were not rivals to the Anunnaki. They were forces beneath the great gods, capable of intrusion, capable of affliction, but also capable of being named, confronted, and expelled. They moved through wind and shadow, across mountains and beneath the earth, and into the fragile boundary of the human body. They were feared, but they were also managed. That balance may be the most revealing part of their story. The Mesopotamian world did not deny fear. It did not pretend that unseen forces were harmless, but it refused to surrender to chaos. It built walls, it carved guardians, it spoke incantations, it appealed upward through hierarchy. In that system, nothing operated outside structure. Even the Utukku belonged somewhere. When a fever rose in the quiet hours, when sleep faltered, when breath felt heavy and the room seemed occupied by something unseen, the explanation did not collapse into meaninglessness. It entered ritual language. The spirit was named. The name created boundary. Today we have different explanations for illness and for the strange sensations of night. We speak of viruses and nervous systems. We describe sleep paralysis in neurological terms. We trace wind patterns through meteorology rather than cosmology. And yet the experience itself has not vanished. The body still falters without warning. The mind still wakes in darkness with a sense of presence. Wind still presses against walls. Night still alters perception. We no longer call those moments Utukku, but we still seek explanation. Perhaps what lingers from that ancient world is not belief in specific spirits, but recognition that human life exists at the edge of what can be controlled. The Mesopotamians expressed that edge through layered hierarchy. The Utukku were one way of naming vulnerability without dissolving order. They were never sovereign, they were never ultimate, they were reminders. Reminders that even in a universe governed by powerful gods, there remained forces that slipped through cracks. Reminders that the body was not invincible. Reminders that boundaries required maintenance. As the centuries passed, their name faded from common speech. New religious frameworks reshaped older ideas. Spirits were reclassified. Moral lines hardened. But the structural memory of unseen presence endured. The Utukku may no longer walk the pages of active ritual, yet the human impulse to personify the unseen has not disappeared. It has simply changed language. When ancient exorcists stood beside a sleeping mat and recited commands into darkness, they were not only fighting spirits, they were fighting uncertainty. And uncertainty remains. The difference is that now we locate it in different categories. We attribute it to chance, to probability, to biology. But even in a modern room, lit by electricity rather than oil flame, the moment between waking and sleep can still feel fragile. The mind can still imagine what it cannot see. In that quiet space, the ancient world feels closer. The Utukku were born in a time when wind carried dust and fear in equal measure, when night had depth beyond streetlights, when illness lacked laboratory explanation. They were shaped by that environment. They made sense within it. Understanding them does not require believing in them. It requires recognizing the human need to map the unseen. Beneath the Anunnaki, within structured cosmos, the Utukku moved as agents of imbalance. They were named, confronted, and returned to their domains. What still walks unseen today may not carry their name. But the sensation of vulnerability, the awareness that not everything is visible or predictable, remains part of the human condition. The Mesopotamians responded with ritual and hierarchy. We respond with science and system. Both are ways of holding uncertainty without surrendering to it. As the room grows quiet and the mind begins to soften, there is comfort in remembering that fear has always been paired with response. That ancient households placed figurines at thresholds, not because they believed themselves doomed, but because they believed defense was possible. Whatever unseen forces move in the margins of understanding, the pattern persists. Name the fear, build the boundary, appeal to higher order, and rest knowing that even in the oldest recorded cosmologies, the spirits beneath the gods were never beyond reach. Sleep settles differently when uncertainty has shape, and somewhere in the long history of humanity, beneath broken ziggurats and fading stars, the memory of those unseen walkers remains not as terror, but as testimony to how carefully we have always tried to understand the dark before closing our eyes.